It's a Raspberry Pi 5 and a keyboard, and it's called the Raspberry Pi 500. The keyboard is the computer again, cramming a Raspberry Pi 5 into a keyboard. A superb update to the Raspberry Pi 400. We get the power of the Raspberry Pi 5 in a convenient form. Thermal performance is excellent, and we easily overclocked it to 3 GHz. Pros: awesome thermal performance. Convenient form factor. Fast and can be made faster. Cons: GPIO access is awkward. Lack of NVMe storage. No camera or touch display connections. Single-board computer maker Raspberry Pi is updating its cute little computer meet keyboard device with better specifications. Named the Raspberry Pi 500, this successor to the Raspberry Pi 400 is as powerful as the current flagship Raspberry Pi, the Raspberry Pi 5. It's available to buy now from Raspberry Pi resellers. The Raspberry Pi 500 is the easiest way to get started with a Raspberry Pi, as it's not as intimidating as the Raspberry Pi 5. When you look at the Raspberry Pi 500, you can't see any chipsets or PCB, printed circuit board. The Raspberry Pi is completely hidden inside a familiar form factor, a keyboard. The idea with the Raspberry Pi 500 is that you can plug in a mouse and display, and you're ready to hit the ground running. If, for example, you have a relative who is using an extremely dated computer with an outdated version of Windows, the Raspberry Pi 500 can easily replace an old PC tower for most computing tasks. When it comes to specifications, the Raspberry Pi 500 features a 64-bit quad-core Arm processor, the same one as the Raspberry Pi 5 uses, 8 GB of RAM, 2 micro-HDMI ports, with support for up to 2 4K displays, 3 traditional USB ports, but no USB-C besides the power port unfortunately, a Gigabit Ethernet port, and a 40-pin expansion header. It comes with native Wi-Fi and Bluetooth support. More importantly, this device brings us back Raspberry Pi's roots. Raspberry Pi computers were originally intended for educational use cases. Over time, tech enthusiasts and industrial customers started using the single-board computers everywhere. For instance, if you've ever been to London's Heathrow Airport, all the departures and arrivals boards are powered by Raspberry Pis. The Raspberry Pi 500 draws inspiration from the not-for-profit Raspberry Pi Foundation's roots. It's the perfect first computer for school. In many ways, it's much better than a Chromebook or an iPad because it is both cheap and highly customizable, encouraging creative thinking. The Raspberry Pi 500 comes with a 32 GB SD card preloaded with Raspberry Pi OS, a Debian-based Linux distribution. It costs $90, which is a slight $20 price increase compared to the Raspberry Pi 400. At launch, only UK and US keyboard variants are available, but versions with French, German, Italian, Japanese, Nordic, and Spanish keyboard layouts are coming soon. And if you're looking for a package that comes with everything you need, Raspberry Pi also sells a $120 desktop kit with a Raspberry Pi 500, a mouse, a 27W USB-C power supply, and a micro-HDMI to HDMI cable. In other news, Raspberry Pi has announced another brand new product, the Raspberry Pi Monitor. It's a 15.6-inch 1080p monitor with a price tag of $100. Since there are quite a few 1080p portable monitors out there, this launch isn't as noteworthy as the Pi 500. But for dyed-in-the-wool Pi fans, there's now a Raspberry Pi branded monitor option too. Design of the Raspberry Pi 500. It's just a keyboard, right? Is what I thought when I received the Raspberry Pi 400 out of the blue in 2020. Yes, the 400 looks like the official Raspberry Pi keyboard, but while the Raspberry Pi 500 retains a very similar form factor, the color scheme favors all white instead of raspberry red and white used in the 400. The Raspberry Pi 500 is essentially a keyboard with a Raspberry Pi 5 inside of it. Just like the Raspberry Pi 400, this is a custom Pi 500 PCB and not a Compute Module 5 on a carrier board. All of the ports are on the back of the case, and we have a single USB 2 port used for your choice of mouse. 2 USB 3 ports, a micro SD card slot, the same as the Raspberry Pi 5. USB Type-C power input, dual 4K micro HDMI ports and GPIO interface, and a Gigabit Ethernet port. Finally, there is a spot to lock your Pi 500 to a desk with a Kensington lock. Having the ports at the back makes total sense. It tidies up the cables and means that we only need one thick edge. The rest can be as thin as possible. The keyboard is good. It's not one of the best mechanical keyboards, but the membrane chiclet keys are responsive and work well even under fast typing. It even has a power button in the top right. Don't fret. It takes a long press to trigger the power off process. Can the Raspberry Pi 500 be overclocked? Oh yes. I took the Raspberry Pi 500 to a stable 3 GHz. I did have to adjust the voltage to keep everything stable, but once I found the magic numbers, the system was stable and performed remarkably well. As you have read above, I overclocked the Pi 500 to 3 GHz, and it ran buttery smooth and surprisingly cool under stress. I'd consider this a successful overclock and one that I would happily keep as a permanent addition. Raspberry Pi 500 microSD card performance. Boot time is impressive at 19.86 seconds, but this is in line with other Raspberry Pi branded A2 microSD cards that we have tested on the Raspberry Pi 5. Pi boot times are relatively locked for microSD, eMMC on the Compute Module 5, and NVMe SSDs. Where we see the biggest difference is in read and write performance, and I'm sad to say that microSD cards are the slowest way to run a Raspberry Pi. I've compared the performance of the Raspberry Pi 500 to the recent Raspberry Pi Compute Module 5, which has both eMMC and NVMe storage options. Using DD to read the entire 32 GB microSD to /dev/null, I recorded the Raspberry Pi 500 reaching 89.2 megabytes per second. Not a slouch, but way slower than NVMe at Gen 3 speed, 768 megabytes per second. Sequential write speeds were recorded using Raspberry Pi Diagnostics, part of the OS. I saw 32.25 megabytes per second with the A2 class micro SD card. For comparison, NVMe Gen 3 reaches 703 megabytes per second. So does this mean that Raspberry Pi OS on the Raspberry Pi 500 is an awful experience? Not at all. We just would have preferred to have a faster storage option. The branded A2 class cards are excellent, and Raspberry Pi OS was snappy and responsive. To be honest, we could happily use the Raspberry Pi 500 like this. But deep down in our heart, we really wanted a little something extra under the hood. Just like the Raspberry Pi 400, the Pi 500 needs a breakout board in order to access the GPIO. Luckily, the pinout is the same, so you can reuse an older breakout board. The port comes covered by a rubber stopper, easily removed with some tweezers. Essentially, you will have the same GPIO pins as the Raspberry Pi 5, and because of the changes to how Python software is installed, PEP 668, and Raspberry Pi's decision to use the RP1 Southbridge for the GPIO, you will have the same experience. All you need to do is use the aforementioned breakout to correctly route the pins for use with a hat. Use cases for the Raspberry Pi 500. Just like the Raspberry Pi 400, the Pi 500 is there to be a 21st century equivalent to the home computers of the 1980s. You plug into a wedge-shaped keyboard, hook up to your display, and start work. But the Raspberry Pi 500 has much more processing power than the Pi 400, and that means it can be a viable desktop computer for those that don't need an RTX 4090 or a power-hungry CPU. In conclusion, I like the Raspberry Pi 500. It's a powerful machine in a pleasant package. I'm old enough to remember the 1980s home computer craze, and this, just like the Pi 400, reminds me of that time. But now we have much more power. This is a great all-rounder, but like I have been saying throughout this review, it shares many good and bad things with the Pi 400, and the GPIO access and the lack of camera/display ports are the only real negatives. The omission of PCIe-based storage is unfortunate, but without an easy access hatch, the plastic would soon break. The Raspberry Pi 500 is the kit that you buy as a gift for someone or as a child's first computer. I can see this being used in schools and, to an extent, in offices around the world. Like what you just watched. Subscribe to our YouTube channel for engaging articles, exclusive content, and the latest updates.